The acronym LASER, what does it stand for?
Oh, I read that in a book. I don't know what it stands for.
I can't even remember what it stands for. It's light something. Light, the A is...
Something?
Light something. I can't even remember now.
Do you know what? I read...
Emission.
No, it's emission. So it's emission of radiation. I know that much. It's light something,
Oh, yeah.
something, the A and the S, emission of radiation.
S is for something or S is for something you can't remember?
S is for something I can't remember.
Oh.
No. Light something, emission of radiation. Very technical.
Ready, put it here when you are.
Are you ready? No, you're not ready.
I might be. I'm good.
Hello and welcome to your Integration Station. I'm your host, Michael, a child and adolescent occupational therapist, and with me, back again, after missing last week, is my co-host, Eleanor.
Hello, I'm also a child and adolescent occupational therapist.
Well,
good to be back.
Yeah, welcome back. I had to go solo last week.
I was just saying I'm surprised to be back today. Just thought you'd be like, no, I'm going solo from now on.
No. It's good to bounce ideas off someone else.
It is good. And I think we're going to have a good conversation today.
Yeah,
as well. I'm
interesting.
looking forward to it.
Well, certainly for those who are interested in today's topic, it should be everybody. Our big topic today is PDA and its difference from ODD. So we will get into that very soon. But first, I think we will just inform people that if they do have any questions, because we normally do Q&A format.
Yep.
But we can. But we thought we wanted to talk about this. But if they do have questions, they can shoot them through to podcast OTFC group, which is our email. Otherwise, our Instagram handle, OTFC group. We also get questions through TikTok. We're back on TikTok. Yes, yep. Eli's
the TikToks, as I heard you reference it at the
TikTokers,
podcast.
TikTokers, whatever you want to call. I actually don't have TikTok. Do you have TikTok?
No.
No, I don't have it. I feel like I should get it because I have lots of people talking about it, like lots of my clients, and I'm like...
Just want to keep up with stuff.
Well, I think best practice is, being able to engage and understand the platforms that young people are using, and being part of it is, for me, is the best way to do that.
Yeah, I get that. Learning by doing.
Yeah. I'll just end up posting stupid stuff all the time.
I think they love that on TikTok.
Coffee stuff.
Yeah.
This is how I make a coffee. This is not how to make a coffee. Anyway, it's probably...
Just appealing to the masses with that content,
True. But if you do enjoy what you're listening to and you have any questions, of course, submit them and share them the podcast to whoever else might be interested, which should be everybody. So why don't we start with our regular segments though?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I guess it's a little bit hard to pick a therapy activity geared at a young person who perhaps has that profile, but I know something that I use in my toolbox quite often is something that you had mentioned in the podcast last week around that expose retreat method, which you had referenced. It's something that maybe you set up an activity, you either expose that young person or you might use that yourself so they can see how that might look. And then it's retreating from there to give them the space to explore that in a way that makes sense for them. And this is something that I actually find really powerful for lots of young people. But when I think about the context for my PDAs, I might be chatting to them about something, they're talking on a topic of interest, we're checking in around the week, and maybe I'll have something set up that I just naturally engage with while I'm speaking with them. Let's say it's like a swing activity, and then I'll just casually move myself away. And something I guess I often look to incorporate with my PDAs is like this intentional nonchalance, that it's coming across in a way that, presents quite casual and laid back, but there's a lot going on in my mind about how I'm presenting this and what I'm looking to achieve. But then by backing away and giving that space without setting any expectation about how that's to be used, I then often find that young person might be able to come over and give it a go. They might back away again when it feels too tricky, or look to engage in a way that they're looking to interact with that. But then I can sort of move back and forward between that. And I'll hold the space with it as well. So it's not that I'm necessarily, I'll give it a go. If they don't use it, then I'll pack it down and put something else up. I might have that consistently set up and repeatedly go back and forth between that, and find that over time, they may then make the choice to engage with that. but it might not be straight off the bat. It needs to just, give that time to settle for them to then feel confident to give something a go. And at no point do I think, am I giving verbal direction about what you need to do with that? I'm using just that physical modeling. Maybe I'm talking to the room about what I'm doing, or as if I'm speaking out loud so they can hear that internal dialogue. And then where it goes is really up to them from there.
So when you're exposing them to the activity, rather than it being this is your idea or this is the client's idea, it's just it's there and you can interact with it if you wish or however you want to.
Yeah, exactly. But then maybe I'm showing them, I'm exposing them to a way that they could potentially use it.
Sure.
But without coupling that with the demand to ask them to do something or then go, hey, I've had a turn, now it's your turn. It's just merely setting that up, showing them what it could look like, but then also giving them the space to come towards that. And that's where that retreat really comes in.
How about a regulation strategy? How would that work? Or should we throw to our theme for this one then?
Let's do it. No therapy activity from Michael, just me.
That's okay.
That's fine.
Regulation, the strategy of the week.
Well, we were talking before about a regulation strategy, and we're talking a lot about co-regulation.
Yes.
And therapeutic use of self.
Yep.
And I think that probably ties in well with maybe working with a young person with a PDA profile. And
Or even ODD, really.
yeah,
as
that's
well.
true.
Yeah,
I guess fits for both.
Yeah. Actually, many young people would that work for. Yeah.
Well, I guess co-regulation generally
Yes, absolutely.
is a pretty effective tool for a lot of the neurodivergent young people we work with, or even young people in general. So when you're working with, let's just say, for example, a PDA, if you're thinking about the way that you use yourself therapeutically as a way to co-regulate, what are some of the things that you might be considering?
A really important thing that I'm keeping in my mind to support that young person to remain regulated and engage is, I guess I'm looking to make myself an equal partner in the activity. So I'm looking to not set myself up as an authoritative figure that we're kind of in this together. And so I'm really mindful about the language that I might use as a result of that, because I think if there's that perception that I have that authority figure status in the space, then that can really heighten what those nervous system responses can look like and increase those feelings of anxiousness. And then what can sometimes happen is that young person might look to equalize that. And so we might start to see some of that avoidance or moments of dysregulation start to occur because they're trying to shift the balance so it feels more comfortable for them to engage. So rather than putting that on them to have to find that balance, if I can pitch myself in a way that feels more comfortable, it can support the activation of that nervous system response to a degree. So I use a lot of stuff around like, let's make a plan together, or I'll give something a go and it doesn't work. And I'm thinking out loud, man, I just can't seem to make this work. I'm not sure what I should be doing with my body differently. And sometimes they'll jump in and they'll give something a go, or they'll make a suggestion. And you're like, yeah, that's an awesome idea. Like maybe I'll try that. And so you come out as a partner in the activities rather than coming at it from hey, I've got an idea. We should do this. I know that you love, Pokemon or Minecraft. I've got a great game that meets your interests, but they're going to see that as, well, nothing but demands pitched by someone else. So I think using yourself as a real partner in an activity can be very supportive, not only for their engagement, but how regulated they remain throughout that session.
Well, I guess the other thing I'd say is if you know a little bit about what works for them, in terms of like, say, in our space, in our sensory spaces that we have, where there's a lot of opportunities to move our body, if you know what works for them in moving their body, then you can expose something that would be supporting their regulation or supporting their arousal level to maybe to lower it. Obviously, they're probably a bit anxious, and you expose that using that therapy activity, and then the regulation strategy in turn is working collaboratively, or here it is, I'm just putting that there, knowing in the background, as you said, like I know that they like to jump and crash, for example.
Yeah, for sure.
That the way I've set it up will invite that sort of activity.
Yeah.
And in doing so, you're setting up something that's also regulating, but it's not your direction.
Yeah. And I think it's all pitched in this way that, you know, there's so much that you're thinking about and the clinical reasoning behind those decisions, but you're communicating it in a way that's very, I don't want to say masked, but it's presented in a way that feels comfortable and feels meaningful and can be quite strategic. And I think something that I guess we should say, not only in regards to these regular segments, but in this podcast generally, you know, we are by no means experts in this field, but we work with a lot of young people who perhaps might meet these profiles. And I don't know about you, but my gorgeous young people, my PDAs and ODD, I have learnt so much from them in terms of how I arm my own toolbox that then helps me support other young people. And with these activities that we're talking about, I guess it's always about meeting that young person with where they're at and using their strengths and their interests. But I guess this is more targeted to how you might therapeutically use yourself as part of that.
True.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Well, in that sense, maybe we'll go on. So the reason we wanted to talk about this is because I don't think we've done specifically a podcast around itself. I know you've put a lot of stuff on social media and have, for anybody that has seen our account, there was a really cool sort of Minecraft Lives, I guess, analogy that was used, which I really enjoyed. So you can certainly look that up at our Instagram account. But there was a question that did come through about PDA and its difference to ODD. And so we thought, well, why don't we just tackle that?
Yeah.
The question was, how is PDA different to ODD disorder? ? I have a feeling ODD might be misunderstood PDA.
We perhaps might start with ODD, or Oppositional Defiant Disorder, which is a presentation defined and diagnosed within the DSM-5.
The DSM-5 is the Diagnostic Statistics Manual for all psychological conditions, essentially. And oppositional defiant disorder comes under that in the class of attention deficit and disruptive behaviour disorders, if we're labelling it exactly as it is.
Yes,
DSM-5.
exactly. And I think with some of the language that we might use as part of this, which is essentially how it's written in the DSM-5, I think is important to provide that context, but then I think we'll talk about it from a bit of a different lens. Yeah. Would you like to read the diagnostic criteria for...
Under ODD, it's defined as a pattern of negativistic, hostile and defiant behaviour lasting for at least 6 months, during which 4 or more of the following are present. So often loses temper, often argues with adults, often actively defies or refuses to comply with adult requests, deliberately annoys people, often blames others for their mistakes or misbehaviour, often touchy or easily annoyed by others, often angry or resentful, is often vindictive. So a lot of stuff in there, and a lot of stuff that they use the word often because I think what they want to convey is the frequency of these behaviours.
Yeah.
And that's, I guess, a way to categorize the diagnosis. Now, for example, like autism is in the DSM-5 as well, and that has very
ADHD.
specific. A lot of our neurodivergent presentations in the DSM-5 as a way to articulate that there is a diagnosis associated to a group of observations of behaviours. Now, fine. Understand that from a diagnostic perspective, but obviously we talk about all the time how a behaviour is a reflection of a person's attempt to try and communicate something. So that's the basic definition of what it is. And, for example, angry, irritable mood could be losing temper, angry, resentful, deliberately annoying others in terms of argumentative and defiant, blaming others for mistakes, or vindictiveness, which, it's such a, wow, isn't it a big word?
I know. It literally says here, has been spiteful or vindictive at least twice within the past 6 months.
Yeah, and vindictiveness, there's a deliberate attempt, right?
Absolutely.
When we sit here as clinicians that work in a space where I believe we try and be as neuroaffirming as possible.
Absolutely.
I see something like vindictiveness, or even argumentative and defiant.
Absolutely.
And my questions are always, how often these children deliberately trying to enact a response or a behaviour because of they want to inflict harm, or they're deliberately doing something. And I think it's so hard to be that concrete or or certain that this is a deliberate ploy.
Absolutely.
So
it's really tough, isn't it? And I think perhaps we'll unpack some of those terms as we have that comparison against PDA as well, because I think I'd like to spend some time chatting that through. But you're right, that's the, in a nutshell, what that diagnostic criteria looks like. And I guess what the flow on from that is they're seeing the impact of this from a functional perspective, whether it's social, academic, or even their engagement in everyday activities. And they typically provide a level of severity as well, from mild through to severe.
And not linked to other sort of disorders, whether it's a depressive episode, bipolar, other sort of psychotic episodes.
And I know in terms of that severity, where they're looking for is where it presents, in how many settings it presents.
Sure.
So if it's across 1 to 2 versus consistently across multiple, whether that's home, school, community spaces, that kind of thing.
And I know that's used in the range of these diagnoses. And even when I think about something like autism, for example, we would always, even though we don't diagnose, we would often ask, how often are these behaviours observed in different environments to get a bit of a pattern, a bit of an idea of where it's occurring as well. So
do you think I'll look at this at one point and I try and apply that neuroaffirming lens?
Maybe.
Curious if
I
that
think
shifts. It's obviously geared very medically from that diagnostic perspective.
And I guess
then how we interpret and use that, we can apply that neuroaffirming lens from there.
I guess this is the conundrum, isn't it? What we've got here is a medical diagnostic statistics manual, and it's very much based on, this is a set of symptoms. This is the presentation, these are the behaviours, therefore it fits in this category. Whereas if we're thinking of the neuroaffirming approach, it's coming from a neurodiversity movement, which is more of a sociological movement. So that those two very different theoretical approaches will have two very different ways of addressing the same situation. So I don't know. Maybe there might be some modification based on neurodiversity movement, certainly a positive shift. But I do feel as though there is always going to be a place for a diagnosis and a medical model in our system. Not that I necessarily agree per se, but I can understand that for something like this, I mean, I'm thinking even from a funding perspective, in order to access funding for certain services, say in Australia, we've got the NDIS. To access funding here, there is certainly still a prerequisite to have some sort of formalised diagnosis. And without something like this, you don't have the affordance to be able to access that funding. So it's probably, without getting too political, there's a big, a big system shift, but can certainly understand why, particularly the neurodiversity movement, would look at this and go, there's a lot of red flags. There. Yeah, a lot of red flags.
But moving on to PDA, which in its technical term, pathological demand avoidance. But I know within that movement that, and I think it's just about with the family that you're working with, understanding how they best like to reference that. For example, I've heard like a persistent or pervasive drive for autonomy, which I think really relevantly captures what that young person might be navigating. So perhaps even just hearing how they'd like that reference. But where PDA sits quite differently to ODD is it's not at this stage a diagnostic criteria per se, and more sits as a profile within the autism spectrum. And so you might hear that that's typically referenced as a young person having PDA traits or a profile within an autistic diagnosis. But I do know there is a growing movement and understanding, and from where we are in South Australia, there are some places that will confirm a PDA profile, whereas others might use it to reference what that drive for autonomy looks like more generally and what approaches might be adopted to support that.
And I know that the PDA profile is much more well known in, say, Australia, the UK, very big in the UK. The US is starting to and Canada is certainly starting to take on a greater understanding of that profile. But outside of essentially those Western countries, it's not as well known, and it's not as well researched or understood. And as you said, because it's a profile, it's kind of like a subtype, and it has. And I guess this is the challenge here, is if something like ODD, it's part of a manual that psychologists and doctors, and it's very well researched and known. whereas PDA profile is still very, it's emerging.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
And so there's still work to be done, but there's certainly a growing evidence that it's a very much present for a lot of young people.
And I think to be able to understand what it truly means to have that pervasive drive for autonomy or even that demand avoidance is understanding what a demand actually is.
Yeah.
And stripping that right back. I think our minds might often go to those really direct requests. You might be asking someone to do something, put your shoes on, come help me with this, you have to do that. And then there's also layered within that things like indirect demands, like when you give praise, there can be an implication that the expectation is that that's done again in the same way, which can be really tricky. Time's another one too, just kind of...
time demands.
Yeah, time demands, like understanding, at a certain time in the day, you'll have to do this, and it's kind of implied within the structure of your day, which is really tricky. There's even like demands within demands. An example that I'd heard of is when you go to the movies, right? So you might think the demand is just accessing that space to engage in that activity, but actually there's expectations around who you're going to talk to buy tickets potentially, the expectation that you'll sit for extended periods without making any noise, the demand of having to sit close by to people, and there might even be other auditory components like listening to people eating their food and things like that. So that's kind of, or even saying, getting ready for the day to go, okay, it's time to get ready for school, but actually that's a string of potentially 10 plus demands in each of the individual steps and components that goes into that seemingly casual request. And then you add in things like social demands, even greetings and asking someone how they are. I think if you are coming at it from the lens that in itself can present as a demand, how much do we manage in any conversation that we have? That it's almost, I imagine like these tennis serves, that it's, if you greet someone, then there's an expectation that you'll potentially say something back, or they might ask a question that you have to respond to. And that's unintentionally then setting demands in that social environment. So there's just so many things that can contribute to demands. And when we're talking about PDA, what we're seeing is this intrinsic activation of the nervous system, anxiety-based responses to demands that they perceive or are actually being asked of them. So imagine for each of those things that we spoke about, if your body has this response, that then a string of behaviours, but which is really a form of communication about how that feels for them, can be elicited. It's really, I just think that's huge, isn't it? Yeah.
And I guess the other thing is, given that, as we've mentioned, PDA is not a diagnosis, it is a profile as part of the autism diagnosis. When we think for a lot of people, a lot of autistic people, one of the key factors is anxiety.
Yeah.
That they're already sitting at a high level of anxiety prior to any demands or anything being directed to them. So they're already sitting at a slightly heightened arousal level.
Yeah.
And so when you start layering on perceived demands, then you're going to enter that fight, flight, freeze, fawn response much quicker.
Absolutely. And I think, when we talk about demand avoidance, it's important to understand that we're all naturally geared towards that. I think in that video that you referenced, we were talking about the lives in Minecraft and thinking about demands that you manage in your day as lives in a video game. So each time that you might have to work to meet a demand, you might be using a life to do so, and then that leads to a depletion of capacity across the day. But in that VA reference, when your alarm goes off in the morning and you lie in bed and you're like, just 5 more minutes, you're avoiding that demand that comes with rising out of bed given that your alarm's gone off, or things that we might avoid and procrastinate. Like we all do that, but we're talking about this marked level of avoidance, which, like you said, is so rooted in anxiety. And I think it's really important to note that marked avoidance doesn't necessarily link with a PDA profile. When we're highly anxious and different demands are being set, I think it's very reasonable to look to avoid that, do something else, perhaps even if that dysregulation was to come about to then impact how we then engage. So it's important to understand that not all demand avoidance is PDA.
And I guess we could talk about it all the time, like the number of times, and I've definitely been in this situation where there's a lot on my plate, I've got a lot to do,
Yeah.
tasks that need to be completed by a certain time frame, and I feel the pressure of that.
Mm.
I mean, I don't think I have a PDA profile. Definitely don't. No, I'm not autistic, so I would say that I don't. But those demands would increase your anxiety, and people talk about procrastination, and procrastination often comes from the fact that I cannot organize my thoughts or how I want things done. And procrastination is a way to avoid a set of demands or a set of tasks, not deliberately, but because you don't have a clear structure or plan of how you want to tackle that, or you're not in the right mind frame to be able to tackle that in that moment. So I can certainly understand that we have to be careful that not every avoidance of demand means that person may have a PDA profile.
And I find myself sometimes with families and just providing that context, that understanding about how anxiety can then impact how we interact and meet demands in our day. And regardless, I think for that young person, some of these low demand approaches that we might use for PDA can be really beneficial. And I think we've spoken about that a lot in previous podcasts, that actually once you've got a well-developed use of that muscle with low demand language, I think you find yourself using it all the time, regardless of what that profile or presentation might look like, because it's so effective.
Yeah.
But for a PDA, where the drive for autonomy comes in, is that they're looking for choice and control as much as they can to then shift that expectation in terms of the demand. And so, it's a very clinical term, pathological demand avoidance, but I suppose what the intention is that it's trying to imply is that it's ingrained. It's a nervous system response for them. And actually they're not making a choice to avoid. Their body and nervous system actually can't help it. So it's having that understanding about where that avoidance is coming from.
So when you outline that comparative to ODD, automatically you can see quite a big difference. And there may be and I can understand there may be some crossover there, because you're talking about, say, ODD having difficulties with authority figures or being able to respond to directions. I know that's often quite a significant hallmark, is that when it comes to, say, teachers, adults, any sort of authority figure that's giving a direction for ODD, that can be quite a trigger. Whereas with PDA, it's a bit more pervasive. It's for anybody and everyone, and it can happen across the board. So but I can see where this question comes in about like the difference between ODD and PDA. And I just thought I'd reference a few things in particular, right? Kind of what you've alluded to there, when I'm reading some of this diagnostic criteria for ODD. And I suppose what can be a bit of a hallmark in this differentiation is that for a young person with ODD, it might be that there's consistent strategies that can be employed over time across environments, and then we see a response that matches that because the right supports are in place for that person at a consistent level, and then they're able to work within that to better support some of these aspects. Whereas often for PDA is you need a lot of flexibility in your approach, and that fluctuating capacity that shifts across the day and meeting those demands is quite significant. And so understanding that something that works one day might not work another, and we have to be quite adaptable. But the intent here with any of these strategies is meeting that young person where they're at. But when I look at this list for ODD, and when, like you said, arguing with authority figures, I think could be seen across both presentations, because like we were just chatting about before, looking for that equalizer, that young person, like a PDA, could be looking to shift that balance so that they feel more in control, and it's not coming from someone directing something to them. They're trying to create this partnership or shift what that equilibrium looks like, which might present like argumentative or not following through on directions, or even that defiance. And I find, some of these things that they're listing here, which are all forms of communication, but I could also interpret this for some of my PDAs as that's a young person who they might be all fight within their nervous system response, or that's actually a means for them to avoid demands. I find quite often we can be very clever in how we avoid, so it almost seems at times socially appropriate, but what they're really looking to do is shift around and move away from what's being asked if that demand has been perceived. So you're saying that might look like they might be quite combative, or they might come across as disrupting social order because they're so anxious, and someone might perceive that as they're defying orders, but it's their level of anxiety that's impacting that situation.
And I look at something too about, you know, they're deliberately annoying others. What if that's that young person, they're trying to interact, but they're not, in terms of some of those social differences, they're not sure how to go about that in a way that feels comfortable for them, but they do know that if we do this, it gets a response. And facilitates an interaction. They're not sure how to initiate that. Or is it attention differences that are starting to shift, and that impulsivity as they become more dysregulated? And they're not, it's not deliberate. Their body actually can't help it, and it's how it's being interpreted, but they're not as in control in the moment as what it looks like. You know, OTs are not diagnosticians, so I think I'm speaking a lot here to just my own questions around this and curiosity. But when it comes to how do they clinically assess spitefulness and vindictiveness, like how do they know what those deliberate actions towards others look like and can say it comes from no other place than spite?
Yeah, unless you've got an fMRI of the brain whilst you're doing an action and things are lit up at the time that it occurs. And I would say that that's probably not the best or most conducive way of getting an effective response either for a young person. I don't know. It's probably a question I don't have an answer for, but it does, you know, I look sometimes at the DSM-5, and I know this is certainly the case for a lot of even, you know, diagnosticians and those who are a lot more aligned with the neurodiversity movement and neuroaffirming and have a lot of questions about it and raise questions. And I think that's okay. Like it's there as for what it's for, but unless we continue to review it and raise questions about it and its effectiveness and particularly wording,
definitely,
then there are certain things. I mean, I know without talking too much about it, I know in terms of, you know, things like the wording of DSM-5, there are certain individuals. I know like Sonny Jane Wise they're someone that does have a lot of dialogue around particular, you know, terms and wording, and understands the benefits of, say, having particular words in order to reach, you know, a diagnosis in order to access funding, but also understands how damaging some of those words can be and how polarizing those things can be for those with the lived experience.
Absolutely. And I just think the interpretation of some of these things, like I'll never forget a session with a beautiful PDA who can, I guess, quite complex in what some of that presentation interaction can look like at times. And there was one session when they had come through and using a lot of those things that we shared about at the start. And this is a young person too that when I initially started working with them, while I was building that sense of safety and trust over time, I would wait for them to initiate conversation with me before I would then respond. I never initiated it myself. And so we'd have sessions where we wouldn't talk at all because I was looking to follow their cue on that. And then there was one session where I was trying to interact and just doing things around the room. And I think at one point I was playing with shaving cream and I was drawing pictures in the shaving cream, and they had come over and erased what I had done and looked at me while they did that and then moved away. And I think that could be really easy to interpret as, oh, they're deliberately trying to do something, disrupt what I'm doing. But I am looking at that in the moment going, oh, okay, that's feeling like too much for them, and how I'm engaging with that's not feeling comfortable, and they trying to communicate that to me in nonverbal cues. And so I didn't see that as spiteful. I was thinking, okay, I actually need to strip back what I'm doing, because this typically does work for us if I do something, that exposed retreat, like we said, that can support a lot of positive engagement. But I need to do something different today, because whatever that they've managed across their day, which I'm not privy to because we've not spoken and unpacked about that, but I can already see that they're managing an increased level of anxiousness, and I'm going to shift what I'm doing as a result. But I can just, when I'm looking at that, I could see how that could be misinterpreted. I could see how the confusion might come about between PDA and ODD and how we identify that.
Hence where the question came from then.
Yeah, I think so. And where they've said, you know, is ODD misunderstood PDA, I think potentially sometimes
it could be seen that way.
Yeah. And being able to differentiate between them is quite tricky.
Yeah. And I guess in summary then for that, then in terms of differentiation, one, obviously ODD is its own separate DSM-5 category. Autism is its own separate DSM-5 disorder. PDA is a profile of autism. So in order to have a PDA profile, you have to have an autism diagnosis. And ODD is a separate diagnosis in itself, but it can be seen, with other ADHD and sometimes I remember years ago before PDA was a thing when I first started working, I had a lot of clients with ODD that were later diagnosed with autism.
Too. Yeah.
Right. And I guess that in itself is an example of, as we progress, understand more about behavior and child development, we can understand that, yes, there are diagnostic criteria, but we can also be, we have a greater understanding of how different presentations and different children might present.
Yeah.
There's more information. And the more we refine it and the more information we have, the better it is. There was a second part to the question and differentiating between enabling PDA and actual needs.
Yes.
And I do hear this a lot when people talk about, are you enabling a particular behaviour or parents enabling behaviours? And, this is probably more general than PDA, but enabling behaviour as a concept, I do find tricky.
Yeah.
Because as a parent, I think, look, I'm trying to do the best I can in the situation and with the skills that I have.
Yeah.
And I don't think anybody would, and look, it might be an unintentional thing, but I don't think anybody's deliberately trying to enable particular behaviours or enable particular things. And even unintentionally, I don't think there's an intent to enable. I think the enabling part comes from the perspective of this individual has something that's happened, or maybe things are harder for them. Let's just say, for example, anxiety, they're more and more anxious. Is my response to them falling over enabling an increased anxious response?
Sure.
And so I'd say I don't know if that's what it is as much as it is that parent's response to that situation is what they know, and is actually what they need in that moment, and how they feel most comfortable responding.
Absolutely.
And
I think where this comes from too, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you there, but just even adding to that, like I can hear sometimes that there's a thought potentially that, well, if I ask something and I see this response, which at times, because knowing that it's rooted in anxiety and knowing that it is this activation of the fight, flight, freeze, fawn response, if what you're seeing is fight or flight in particular, I think, where you might see escalations in emotional responses, and whether that's verbal or physical, and it can be quite intense at times what those physical responses or even those verbal responses might look like, because that young person is just so desperately trying to remove the demand and get themselves out of the situation. They're trying to make this threat of the demand go away. That the concern, I think, comes from, well, if I don't ask them to do this, then they're not doing this thing I want them to do and progress in, and therefore I'm reinforcing that these responses are okay, right? But then I think if you do try and set boundaries around that, then you're probably going to see that escalation and unintentionally reinforce that as well, that they need to escalate further and further and further to regain control in that situation. So that's probably not going to work either. But the intent being that if we can make really safe spaces, because I suppose that's a way that in each of these profiles we can look to support that young person to engage. We want really strong senses of security and trust. And I know that you'd mentioned in a previous podcast about just building rapport, but this is something we're talking about, a relationship long term. Sometimes that can look like consistent relationship building over the space of a year, years, and how important continuing those foundations can be. Because if we can set it up in a way that's safe and we can meet that young person where they're at, when they're ready, they can make a choice to engage, and that can look different, I think. And we often talk a lot around planting the seed. So if there's something that you're looking to work towards, modeling that, showing that, you doing that, and just even little incidental throwaway comments can plant a seed over time that they can then make the choice to engage with, and it can be really useful. So I think it's about understanding the concern with enabling something, but is it working doing it differently and trying to be more of that authority figure and trying to draw a line in the sand and trying to be explicit and expect follow through? Is that really working, or is there something that we can be doing differently too?
I think the biggest challenge here is more on the caregiver, the adult, the person, the relationship.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go back to our talk earlier in March around the double empathy problem.
Yeah.
And how a certain neurotypical expectation on a neurodivergent person and differences in understanding, and here we're talking about differences in expectations or demands or however you want to term it. And the biggest thing here is that if you're a adult, whether you're a therapist, whether you're a parent, caregiver, a teacher who is working with someone who does present with a PDA profile, you're going to have to be comfortable with not having control.
Yeah.
And for a lot of us, not having control is really hard.
Yeah.
You know, because someone with a PDA profile, if they don't have a sense of autonomy, then that can be so challenging to even have any feeling of trust in their end.
Yeah.
And if you're coming in with I use the term top-down approach or an old school sort of, do this, do that.
Yeah.
But, or even, it doesn't even have to be that way. It could be a subtle attempts at expecting something consistently.
Yeah.
It's like dying by 1,000 cuts.
That's so true.
Then
it is.
Then in that way, you are trying to you're trying to maintain a sense of control without understanding that you can't have all the control in the situation. Now, again, I'm not saying avoiding all demands together. I'm not saying letting no boundaries, nothing at all. And I know a lot of people, in the PDA space do talk about that's not the way to do it.
No.
But it's about picking your battles.
Yeah.
Finding the right way and consistency.
Yep, absolutely. And I think fostering opportunities for collaboration, negotiation at times. And this is the same for ODD as well.
Absolutely.
And moments
for any young person. Really,
but moments of choice and control, so they don't feel like their whole world, expectations and what is needed from them is set by someone else. And fostering that opportunity for autonomy is so important. And I think the relational safety is huge as part of this too, because if that trust can be established and there are secure relationships, I think one of the biggest things for me with the young people I've worked with in either of these presentations is if that trust is there, when I do make the choice to ask something explicitly or roundabout, because of the trust that's been established, that lessens the demand. If you don't have that as a building block, that demand is going to be perceived completely differently, and you will see more of those references that we spoke about. So trying to position yourself differently in that can make all the difference.
What about people that say that PDA is not a thing? Sorry, that's a question without notice. But I think there'd be parents out there that say, "Oh, they're just not listening," or PDA. I don't believe in PDA. How do we? I mean, apart from listening to this podcast and educating, how do you address that in its infancy in the first situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's really hard too, isn't it? Because I think it's very easy to look at how things have been in the past and go, that classic mindset of like, oh, well, I turned out okay. But actually, how many things are we managing as a result of that? And I think more conversations like this, or even hearing, importantly,
lived experience,
the experience of those young people to advocate for what that looks like. And part of me hopes that finally one day, maybe in terms of this DSM-5 criteria, that some of these things are thrown out completely. Now, this is very, this is quite holistic, but that there's just this understanding that all brains are different and there's no disorders that are labelled as part of that, or, wishful thinking perhaps, but that for every person that we come across, we're meeting them where they're at and we've got multiple ways to support them to engage. And it's not, well, hang on a second, we do it this way, why aren't you complying? I think that's the concern too. Lots of PDAs that I work with actually are these gorgeous young girls who the number of times I hear they're a model student and how they show up in the school space and there's no concerns. And then they come home and they're melting down, they're overwhelmed, they go through periods of burnout. You see this withdrawal from the school space, and it's not understood in that environment what they need, because a lot of them, they can be all fawn where they are complying, they're people pleasing. And we can reinforce that unintentionally sometimes too when they do try to find their voice to share what they're feeling in the moment, but that's shut down. Even if it's done with kind words and good intentions, it just reinforces that the only way for them to get out of a situation that's stressful is to say yes and back down themselves. And you just don't want it to get to that point. So I hope that there's that education that can happen over time. And I think lived experience is going to be a huge aspect to that. And even some of the people that you've referenced that just do incredible work in that environment, just to support those conversations. And hopefully, allies like us can jump in and help to facilitate that too. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same. I guess it's the same sort of thing as, an older generation saying, "Oh, I don't understand why such and such have this sentiment." And I think it's just that it's a generational thing, or it's just education. I think education is the biggest part of this. However you do it, and I think you just have to find a way of getting that message across.
If you haven't been exposed to it and you're hearing this, you're just thinking, oh, okay, you just don't have experience with that. You don't know what that looks like, and you don't know how hard it can be for some of these young people to engage in spaces when this is what they're navigating in these worlds that aren't set up for them. Yeah.
What I was going to mention was some places you could find some more info about PDA. I know you have some some resources that you like to refer to. A really good book that I like is by Teresa Kidd, who's a psychologist in WA, and she had a great book about teens and anxiety, particularly with autism, and has a whole section about PDA profile. And that's a really useful one. Yellow Ladybugs.
So good.
Great resource for neurodivergent and gender diverse young people as well. Reframing Autism has some really good stuff.
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think the PDA Society in the UK also has some excellent resources for parents, caregivers, but also health professionals as well. And actually, I had seen a resource recently which was created by the Department for Education around PDA in schools, and I thought that was excellent too. Actually, it is really good.
Okay.
And I think reinforces a lot of things that we try and educate schools around and where that's coming from. Yeah,
great.
Yeah, just a really digestible single page kind of handout. It's great.
Excellent. I'm sure there are plenty of other places where people can get information, but start with this podcast first and then branch out from there. But if anybody does have other questions, please send them through to our email, podcast ODD group, otherwise Instagram or TikTok. Either of those
options. Plenty
of options there. So that was insightful. Thank you for your expertise in unpacking PDA and its difference with ODD there, and some activities and ways to communicate. Actually, one little thing I think I mentioned in a previous podcast actually about language is I really like the Declarative Language Handbook by Linda K. Murphy.
Okay.
And she talks a lot about using declarative versus imperative language, which is very much that low demand language.
Yep.
And has some really good, it's only a little 100 pages or so, and some good examples, really breaks it down.
Yeah, that's really good.
And a good little resource for parents as well. So just remember to throw that one in there as well.
No, I'm very, very happy to share on this topic because I think my awesome young friends that I've met with ODD PDA, I just, like I said, I just feel like I have learned so much from them, and pretty incredible, I think, what they can offer and support with, and being able to share what some of those learnings are is something I feel very passionately about. Yeah.
I can hear it. Anything else before we finish up?
No, just a little shout out to Fletch.
Shout out to Fletch. Yes. Hope he's doing well. I wonder if he knows what the acronym LASER stands for.
Oh, he probably does.
He probably does. Well, on that note, we'll head off and we'll speak to you guys soon. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.